There are wounds that time never heals, not because they cannot heal, but because no one ever tells the truth. When Elijah Brooks died after spending 40 years repairing the cars of nearly everyone in Maple Grove, his family expected the church doors to open one last time. Instead, the pastor closed them. One sentence changed everything. "I'm sorry. I cannot conduct the funeral of a man whose past has never been made right." Silence that followed spread through town faster than the news of Elijah's death. Neighbors whispered, old rumors returned. People who had accepted rides, repairs, and kindness from Elijah suddenly remembered stories they had never bothered to question. His family wasn't just grieving, they were being judged. And none of them knew that before the week was over. A small wooden box hidden in an old widow's closet would expose a truth that had been buried for 30 years. For more than 4 decades, Brooks Auto Repair sat on the corner of Jefferson Street and Pine Avenue. The faded blue building wasn't impressive, but nearly everyone in Maple Grove had parked a car there at one time or another. If someone couldn't afford a repair, the owner often found a way to help anyway. High school teachers, single mothers, retired veterans, young couples trying to stretch every paycheck, they all knew Elijah Brooks. He was the kind of man who believed a person's character was measured by what they did when nobody was watching. He rarely spoke about his faith, but he lived it every day. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Elijah suffered a massive heart attack while opening his garage. The paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. By noon, the news had reached every corner of Maple Grove. Customers stood outside the shop in silence. Former employees lowered their heads in prayer. People who hadn't seen Elijah in years found themselves remembering small acts of kindness they had almost forgotten. A repaired transmission paid for anonymously, groceries delivered after a house fire, free oil changes for widows living on fixed incomes. His daughter, Angela Brooks, moved through the first 2 days after his death almost mechanically. There were death certificates to sign, relatives to call, flowers to arrange, and endless decisions no grieving child ever feels prepared to make. Her younger brother, Marcus, barely left their mother's old house. Every room reminded him of his father. Every tool in the garage still carried the imprint of Elijah's hands. There was never any question about where the funeral would be held. Elijah had attended New Hope Missionary Baptist Church for nearly 40 years. He had helped repair the church buses without charging a dime. He had volunteered during community food drives. Even after he stopped serving officially, he quietly donated money whenever the church needed unexpected repairs. The Brooks family assumed Pastor Nathaniel Carter would welcome the opportunity to honor a faithful member of the congregation. Angela called the church office on Thursday morning. The secretary answered warmly. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said softly. "Pastor Carter is expecting your call." That sentence gave Angela comfort for a few brief moments. Everything felt normal. She gathered the funeral paperwork, drove to the church, and walked into the pastor's office believing they were simply going to discuss service times and scripture readings. Instead, she found Pastor Carter standing beside his desk with his Bible closed and both hands folded in front of him. His face carried sympathy. But something else was there too, hesitation. He asked Angela to sit down. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, he took a slow breath. "Angela," he began quietly, "this is one of the hardest conversations I've ever had." She smiled politely, assuming he was choosing delicate words because of her grief. Then everything changed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I cannot conduct the funeral of a man whose past has never been made right." Angela stared at him, convinced she had misunderstood. "I'm sorry. What did you say?" The pastor lowered his eyes. "There are unresolved matters surrounding your father's history with this church. Until those matters are publicly addressed, I don't believe it would be appropriate for New Hope to host his funeral." Rooms suddenly felt smaller. Angela's heartbeat echoed in her ears. "My father spent 40 years serving this church. I understand. Repaired your church van. I know. Donated money when the roof leaked. I know. Then what unresolved matters are you talking about?" Pastor Carter looked toward the stained glass window before answering. There are things that happened long before I became pastor, stories that were passed down by the previous leadership. I cannot ignore them." Angela's voice trembled. "Stories?" The pastor nodded. "There were accusations involving church funds many years ago. Your father never publicly cleared his name." For a moment, Angela couldn't breathe. Those rumors, she hadn't heard them spoken aloud since she was a little girl. She remembered whispers stopping whenever her father entered a room. She remembered children repeating things they had heard from adults. She remembered asking Elijah once if any of it was true. He had simply smiled, hugged her, and said, "One day you'll understand why some people choose silence." He never explained what he meant. Now that silence had returned, only this time it threatened to bury him a second time. Angela stood slowly. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "So you're judging my father based on rumors," Pastor Carter answered carefully. "I'm making a decision based on the information entrusted to me." Looked directly at him. "Then I hope you're absolutely certain the information is true." Without another word, she picked up her folder and walked out. Neither of them realized someone standing just outside the office door had overheard every word. And before the sun set that evening, the entire town would know exactly what the pastor had done. Angela Brooks stepped out of Pastor Nathaniel Carter's office without looking back. The church hallway felt strangely quiet, yet every footstep echoed through the building as though the walls themselves had heard the conversation. She tightened her grip around the black folder containing funeral papers that were now useless. She had entered New Hope Missionary Baptist Church expecting to leave with a funeral date. Instead, she was leaving with something far heavier than grief. She was leaving with humiliation. Outside, the afternoon sun seemed almost offensive in its brightness. Cars moved along Jefferson Street as though nothing had happened. Birds landed on the church lawn. Somewhere nearby, children laughed on a playground. Angela sat behind the steering wheel of her father's old pickup truck but couldn't bring herself to start the engine. She rested both hands on the wheel and finally allowed the tears she had fought so hard to hold back. They came silently, one after another, until her vision blurred. She wasn't crying only because the church had refused her father. She was crying because, for the first time in years, she had heard those old accusations spoken as though they were established facts. Rumors she thought had died decades earlier had somehow survived long enough to define Elijah Brooks after his death. Inside the church, Pastor Carter remained standing behind his desk long after Angela had gone. His Bible lay unopened exactly where he had placed it. He told himself he had made the responsible decision. Church leaders before him had spoken carefully about Elijah Brooks whenever the subject came up. The story had always been the same. Money disappeared. Questions were asked. Elijah never defended himself. No public apology was ever given. To Pastor Carter, silence had always sounded like guilt, yet something about Angela's final words refused to leave his mind. "I hope you're absolutely certain the information is true." He repeated the sentence quietly to himself. Then he bowed his head in prayer, asking God for wisdom. He had no idea that the decision he believed protected the church was about to become the greatest test of his ministry. The man standing outside the office door remained frozen for several moments after Angela left. His name was Culvin Reed, chairman of the church's outreach committee. He hadn't intended to overhear the conversation. He had simply arrived to discuss preparations for the annual food drive when Angela's raised voice stopped him in the hallway. Every word after that had reached him clearly through the slightly open office door. Culvin walked slowly toward the parking lot, deeply unsettled. He had respected Pastor Carter for years, but he had respected Elijah Brooks even longer. Elijah had repaired Culvin's truck 3 different times without charging him the full price because he knew Culvin had been raising 3 children alone after his wife's death. Calvin couldn't reconcile the generous man he had known with the accusations he had just heard repeated. By the time he arrived home, his wife noticed something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked. Calvin hesitated, then he answered quietly. "Pastor Carter just refused to bury Elijah Brooks." She stared at him in disbelief. "Refused?" He nodded. "It was because of those old church rumors." Within an hour, she mentioned it to her sister while asking for help with dinner preparations. Her sister mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor called another church member. By sunset, the story had spread through Maple Grove faster than anyone imagined possible. But it didn't spread accurately. It never does. Hidden, at the Brooks family home, Marcus sat alone inside his father's garage. Nothing had been touched since the morning Elijah died. The socket wrench still rested on the workbench. His reading glasses lay beside an old repair manual with grease marks across the cover. A half-finished coffee mug remained near the toolbox, exactly where Elijah had left it before opening the shop that Tuesday morning. Marcus picked up the wrench slowly. He could almost hear his father's voice. Always tighten the bolts evenly. Don't rush the job just because nobody's watching. That had been Elijah's way. Everything mattered, even the work no one else noticed. Marcus's phone vibrated. It was Angela. He answered immediately. The pastor give us a date. Silence. Marcus already knew the answer. What happened? Angela struggled to steady her voice. He refused. Marcus stood abruptly. What do you mean he refused? He said Dad's past was never made right. For several seconds, Marcus couldn't speak. Anger rose so quickly that it drowned out every other emotion. My father spent half his life helping that church. I know, fixed their buses. I know, paid for repairs out of his own pocket. I know, they repaid him like this. Angela closed her eyes. I didn't even know those rumors still existed. Marcus looked around the garage. Every wrench, every engine part, every faded photograph on the wall reminded him of the man everyone in town claimed to know. Yet somehow they had chosen to remember only the one thing nobody had ever proven. That evening, as darkness settled across Maple Grove, lights came on inside a small white house at the edge of town. An 84-year-old widow named Evelyn Turner sat quietly in her living room with a cup of untouched tea. Her telephone had rung 3 separate times. Each caller had repeated the same shocking news. The pastor had refused Elijah Brooks' funeral. For several long minutes, Evelyn stared toward the hallway leading to her bedroom. Finally, she whispered one sentence to herself. So, it's finally happening. She stood slowly, leaning on her wooden cane, and walked down the narrow hallway she had traveled thousands of times before. At the back of her bedroom closet sat an old cedar chest covered in blankets. She carefully folded the blankets aside. Beneath them rested a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue ribbon. Her hands trembled as she lifted it. Dust covered the lid. She brushed it away gently. Tears filled her eyes before she even opened it. Inside lay dozens of handwritten letters, every one of them signed by the same man, Elijah Brooks. She closed the box again and whispered softly, I promised I wouldn't open this until the truth was needed. Outside her window, thunder rolled across the Georgia sky. For 30 years, that little wooden box had remained hidden from the world. By the end of the week, it would change everything. The storm rolled over Maple Grove just before midnight. Rain tapped gently against Evelyn Turner's windows, while lightning briefly illuminated the quiet living room. The old wooden box rested on her dining table exactly where she had placed it after returning from her bedroom. For nearly 30 years, it had remained hidden beneath blankets inside the cedar chest. Now, for the first time since Elijah Brooks placed it in her hands, she slowly untied the faded blue ribbon. The lid creaked softly as it opened. Inside were dozens of carefully folded envelopes, each worn with age but remarkably preserved. Every envelope carried the same familiar handwriting. Some were addressed simply to Sister Evelyn. Others bore no address at all, as though Elijah had written them only to leave behind pieces of himself. Every letter ended the same way. Elijah Brooks. Evelyn closed her eyes before picking up the first letter. Her fingers trembled. I prayed this day would never come, she whispered. But I knew it would. She unfolded the oldest letter carefully. The paper had yellowed with time and the ink had faded slightly, yet Elijah's handwriting remained clear. My dear Sister Evelyn, it began, if you're reading this, then the day I feared has finally arrived. I don't know whether I'll still be here when these words are opened, but I do know one thing. If people are asking questions about my past, please don't answer them until the right time comes." Evelyn stopped reading. A tear rolled quietly down her cheek. She had memorized those words years ago. Still, they hurt every time she saw them. Across town, the Brooks family sat together around the dining room table for the first time since Elijah's death. No one was eating. Angela had spread funeral brochures across the table, crossing out churches one after another. Every phone call she made ended the same way. "I'm sorry. We've heard about the situation." Some pastors spoke kindly. Others avoided giving an answer altogether. A few simply said they weren't comfortable becoming involved. Marcus finally pushed his chair back. "So that's it?" Angela looked at him. "What do you mean? They've already decided Dad was guilty." "No one has said that." "They don't have to." Room fell silent. Their cousin Denise quietly folded the funeral program samples and stacked them neatly. "What are we going to do?" she asked softly. Angela looked toward the family photograph hanging above the fireplace. It showed Elijah standing in front of Brooks Auto Repair with grease on his hands, and the same gentle smile he had worn almost every day of his life. She answered without taking her eyes off the picture. "We're going to bury him with dignity, even if nobody else shows up." The following morning, Maple Grove woke beneath gray skies. The rumor had already become the town's biggest conversation. Customers discussed it inside the local diner. Barbers debated it between haircuts. Cashiers repeated it quietly at the grocery store. Some defended Elijah. Others insisted the pastor wouldn't have acted without good reason. Almost nobody admitted they actually knew what had happened 30 years earlier. They simply repeated what someone else claimed to remember. At Brooks Auto Repair, bouquets of flowers continued to appear outside the locked garage. Someone placed a handwritten note beside the front door. It simply read, "Thank you for helping my mother when nobody else would." An hour later, another note appeared. "You fixed my first car for free. I'll never forget it." Then another, and another. By lunchtime, dozens of handwritten messages covered the garage windows. People remembered Elijah's kindness far more clearly than they remembered the rumors. Inside New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, Pastor Carter noticed attendance at the Wednesday Bible study was unusually quiet. Conversation stopped whenever he entered a room. Church members smiled politely, but something had changed. After the closing prayer, Deacon Louise Mitchell approached him. "Pastor." "Yes, I've been thinking about Elijah Brooks." "So have I." She hesitated. "I wasn't here when everything happened." "Neither was I." "Then how do we know what really happened?" Pastor Carter didn't answer immediately, because for the first time, he realized he couldn't honestly say he knew. Everything he believed came from conversations with leaders who had since passed away. Documents had disappeared years earlier. Meeting minutes had been lost. No one remaining on the church board had personally witnessed the events. They had inherited conclusions, not evidence. That realization disturbed him far more than he expected. Late that afternoon, Calvin Reed stood outside Brooks Auto Repair staring at the growing collection of flowers. He remembered something Elijah once told him after replacing his transmission. "The easiest thing in the world is believing the worst about somebody." Calvin hadn't understood those words at the time. Now they echoed inside his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Back at Evelyn Turner's home, the letters remained spread across the dining table. She had spent nearly 6 hours reading them. Some spoke about faith, others about forgiveness. Several contained instructions she had promised never to reveal unless absolutely necessary. One envelope looked different from all the others. It was thicker. Its edges were sealed with dark red wax. Across the front, in Elijah's unmistakable handwriting, were just 6 words, to be opened only when necessary. Evelyn reached toward it, then stopped. Her breathing grew shallow. She wasn't afraid of what the letter said. She was afraid of what it would do. Because once that seal was broken, there would be no putting the truth back inside the box. Evelyn Turner sat motionless for several minutes, the sealed envelope resting between her trembling hands. Rain continued to fall outside, but inside the little white house the only sound was the ticking of an old grandfather clock in the hallway. 30 years earlier, Elijah Brooks had looked into her eyes, placed that envelope inside the wooden box, and asked her to make a promise. "No matter what people say about me," he had told her. Don't let this letter become revenge. Let it become truth. There's a difference. She had never forgotten those words. Now the moment had finally arrived. With slow, careful hands, Evelyn reached for the small letter opener that rested beside an old family Bible. The red wax seal cracked with a soft snap that echoed through the quiet room. She unfolded the letter. Unlike the others, this one was only a single page. The handwriting was steady, almost peaceful. "My dear sister Evelyn," it began, "if you are opening this letter, then people have chosen my silence over my character. Before you show anyone these papers, remember that the purpose is not to shame anyone. It is to free those who have been imprisoned by a lie, including those who believed it." Evelyn paused. She pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes. Even now, Elijah was asking for mercy, not justice, not revenge, mercy. She continued reading. "First thing people must understand is this. I did not steal $1 from God's house." Breathing caught. Those words were simple, direct, unequivocal, yet Elijah offered no explanation. Instead, the letter instructed her to deliver the wooden box to only one person, Pastor Nathaniel Carter, not the church board, not the newspapers, not Elijah's family, only the pastor. Across town, Pastor Carter sat alone inside the church library. The question Deacon Louise Mitchell had asked earlier refused to leave him. Then how do we know what really happened? He unlocked a narrow filing cabinet tucked beneath a shelf of worn church directories. Dust coated nearly every folder inside. Financial reports stretched back decades. But as he searched the years surrounding the old accusations against Elijah Brooks, something immediately felt wrong. Several folders were missing, not misplaced. Missing, the labels jumped from one year to another as though an entire chapter of the church's history had simply vanished. He searched again. Nothing. Board meeting minutes from that period were gone. Treasurer reports were gone. Building committee records were gone. Only a few faded donation ledgers remained. Pastor Carter leaned back in his chair. For years he had accepted the story without asking for evidence. Now there was almost no evidence left to find. The following morning, Calvin Reed unlocked the side entrance to the church fellowship hall. Volunteers were preparing food boxes for families in need, just as Elijah had helped them do so many times before. As Calvin arranged canned goods on long folding tables, an elderly maintenance worker named Walter Jenkins watched him quietly. Walter had worked around the church for more than 40 years. He rarely spoke about the past, but this morning was different. "Been thinking about Elijah." Calvin looked up. "I have." Walter nodded slowly. "He was a better man than most folks knew." "You knew him well," Walter smiled sadly. "I knew enough." Calvin stepped closer. "He steal that money?" Walter remained silent for several moments, then he answered carefully. "Never saw Elijah steal anything." "Everyone says," Walter interrupted him gently. "People say a lot of things." He picked up an old broom and continued sweeping. "Problem with rumors is that they never have to prove themselves." Before Calvin could ask another question, Walter quietly walked away. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, yet it planted the first genuine seed of doubt Calvin had ever allowed himself to consider. Flowers now stretched nearly the entire length of the storefront. Children had drawn pictures. Former customers had left handwritten thank you cards. An elderly widow placed fresh roses beneath the garage sign before quietly walking away. Marcus stood beside his sister reading one message after another. "You repaired my brakes when I couldn't pay. You gave my grandson his first job. You never let me leave without making sure my car was safe." Marcus folded the notes carefully. "Funny," he said quietly. Angela looked at him. "What is?" "The whole town remembers everything Dad did for them." He glanced toward the church steeple rising above the trees. "But somehow nobody remembers who he really was." Just then, Angela's phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name she didn't recognize. She hesitated before answering. "Hello?" An elderly voice spoke softly. "My name is Evelyn Turner." Angela's expression changed immediately. "I knew your father." Angela sat down on the curb without realizing she had done so. "I think," Evelyn continued, her voice trembling, "it's finally time we talked." Neither woman realized someone standing across the street had just witnessed the entire conversation. A local newspaper reporter lowered her camera. She had come hopping to photograph the memorial flowers. Instead, she had just captured the beginning of a story that would soon shake Maple Grove to its very foundation. Angela Brooks barely remembered driving across Maple Grove. The phone call from Evelyn Turner replayed over and over in her mind. "I knew your father. It's finally time we talked." Those words carried a weight she couldn't explain. After ending the call, Evelyn had given her a simple address on Willow Creek Road, just outside town. Angela arrived just before sunset. Marcus insisted on driving separately after she told him about the mysterious call. Neither of them knew what to expect. The small white house sat beneath two towering oak trees. Time had weathered the porch, but the flower beds were carefully maintained. A single porch light glowed softly as if it had been waiting for them. Before Angela could knock, the front door opened. 84-year-old Evelyn Turner stood quietly with both hands resting on her wooden cane. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back. Her eyes were tired, but they were kind. "You have your father's eyes," she said gently. Angela felt tears threaten again. "You knew him?" Evelyn nodded. "I knew the man everyone forgot." She stepped aside. "Please, come in." The living room carried the warmth of another generation. Family photographs covered the walls. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. Fresh tea rested untouched on a lace-covered table. But Angela's attention immediately settled on the wooden box. It rested exactly in the center of the dining table. Marcus stopped walking. "What's in it?" Evelyn looked at the box for several seconds before answering. 30 years of silence. No one spoke. Finally, Evelyn sat down slowly. "Your father came here one rainy evening almost 3 decades ago." Marcus frowned. "Why?" He knew something terrible had happened. Angela leaned forward. "What happened?" Evelyn shook her head gently. "If I tell you everything now, you'll do exactly what your father begged me not to do." Marcus's frustration surfaced immediately. "Our father's funeral has been refused." "I know. The whole town thinks he was a thief." "I know. You're still protecting whoever did this." Evelyn met his eyes without anger. "No." She placed one hand on the wooden box. "I'm protecting your father's wishes." Silence filled the room once again. Finally, Angela spoke. "Then why call us?" "Because," Evelyn answered softly, "your father also knew there would come a day when someone would need to carry this truth." She slowly opened the wooden box. Inside lay dozens of carefully arranged letters, old church envelopes, faded receipts, canceled checks, and a small leather notebook worn smooth with age. Marcus stared in disbelief. Had all this? For 30 years. Angela reached toward the papers. Evelyn gently stopped her. Yet, she lifted one envelope from the top. "This is the only letter your father wanted me to read before the others." She unfolded it carefully. Her voice trembled as she read. "My children are standing in this room one day. Tell them I love them enough to let them be angry with me if it meant protecting innocent people." Marcus lowered his head. Angela covered her mouth. Neither had ever imagined hearing their father's words again. Evelyn continued. "There will come a moment when the truth can no longer remain hidden. When that day comes, don't give these papers to my family first." She looked directly at Angela. "Your father named only one person." Angela already knew the answer. "Pastor Carter." Evelyn nodded. "He believed the pastor deserved the chance to choose truth before the town demanded it." Across town, Pastor Carter remained inside his office long after darkness settled over Maple Grove. The missing records continued to trouble him. He searched through old church directories, financial ledgers, committee rosters, anything that might explain why an entire chapter of church history had vanished. Then something caught his attention. Tucked inside a faded membership directory from 31 years earlier was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a financial record. It wasn't a meeting minute. It was a handwritten maintenance request. At the bottom appeared a familiar signature, Elijah Brooks. Pastor Carter unfolded it carefully. The note requested repairs for the church fellowship hall roof, nothing unusual, until he noticed the date. It had been written 3 days after the money everyone claimed Elijah had stolen. If Elijah had truly disappeared in disgrace, why was he still volunteering to repair the church? The timeline no longer made sense. For the first time since becoming pastor, Nathaniel Carter whispered words he never imagined saying aloud. What if we've been wrong? Back at Evelyn's home, Marcus stood near the window looking out into the gathering darkness. So what happens now? Evelyn carefully closed the wooden box. Tomorrow morning, she said quietly, we take this box to New Hope Missionary Baptist Church. Angela looked at her. And if Pastor Carter refuses to listen, Evelyn's expression remained calm. He won't. You sound very certain. A faint smile crossed the elderly woman's face. Because your father knew something about Pastor Carter that none of us understood until now. Angela frowned. What? Evelyn rested both hands on the wooden box. He believed that a man who truly loves God will always choose the truth, once he's finally allowed to see it. Outside, thunder rolled again over Maple Grove. None of them noticed the dark sedan parked quietly beneath the oak trees across the street. Inside sat a man watching the house through binoculars. As Evelyn turned off the dining room light, he picked up his phone and spoke only one sentence. Open the box. Then he ended the call, for the first time in 30 years. Someone besides Evelyn knew the truth was finally beginning to emerge. Morning came quietly over Maple Grove. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets washed clean beneath a pale Georgia sunrise. For the first time in days, the air felt still. Yet beneath that calm, every person connected to Elijah Brooks seemed to wake with the same uneasy feeling. Today, something was going to change. At New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, Pastor Nathaniel Carter unlocked the front doors earlier than usual. He hadn't slept much. Elijah's handwritten maintenance request still rested on his desk beside the faded church directory. He had read it at least 20 times during the night. The date refused to leave his mind. 3 days after the alleged theft. If Elijah had really stolen church money and fled in disgrace, why had he continued volunteering? Why was he requesting permission to repair the fellowship hall roof? Why did no one ever mention that? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Across town, Angela and Marcus followed Evelyn Turner's car through the quiet streets. The wooden box rested carefully on the back seat beside her, wrapped once again with its faded blue ribbon. No one spoke during the drive. Marcus watched the church steeple slowly rise above the trees. I still don't understand, he finally said. If Dad wanted the truth known. He looked at Evelyn through the rearview mirror. Why wait 30 years? Evelyn kept both hands steady on the steering wheel. Because your father believed timing matters almost as much as truth, Marcus sighed. I don't think I understand him anymore. You will. Her answer came gently, but not all at once. When they arrived at New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, the parking lot was nearly empty. Only Pastor Carter's sedan sat near the entrance. Evelyn stepped out first, carefully lifting the wooden box into her arms despite its weight. Angela moved to help. Got it. Evelyn smiled softly. No, she looked down at the box. I promised Elijah I'd carry it myself. Inside the church, Pastor Carter heard a knock on his office door. Come in. Door opened slowly. His expression changed immediately. Sister Evelyn. It's been a long time, Pastor. He stood to greet her. Then he noticed the wooden box. His smile disappeared. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Evelyn placed the box gently on the pastor's desk. I believe this belongs to the truth. Pastor Carter looked from the box to Angela, then to Marcus. Confusion filled his face. What is this? Evelyn answered quietly. Reason Elijah Brooks never defended himself. Room fell silent. Pastor Carter slowly sat down. He rested one hand on the weathered lid. I don't understand. You will. She untied the faded blue ribbon one final time. As the lid opened, the faint scent of old paper filled the office. Dozens of letters, canceled checks, donation receipts, church envelopes. A leather notebook, every item carefully arranged, every item preserved. Pastor Carter picked up the notebook first. Its cover was cracked with age. Inside the front page, written in Elijah Brooks' unmistakable handwriting, were 6 simple words, for whoever chooses truth over comfort. Pastor Carter swallowed hard. He opened the first page instead of explanations. He found dates, payments, amounts, names, every entry carefully recorded. Some listed anonymous donations made to the church over nearly 7 years. Others recorded repairs Elijah had completed without requesting reimbursement. One entry immediately caught his attention. Roof repair. paid personally. Do not charge the church. Another. Youth van transmission. No invoice. Another. Anonymous offering. Building fund. The pages continued, year after year, quiet acts of generosity, quiet sacrifices. None of them matched the portrait of the man he believed he knew. Marcus leaned forward. What does it mean? Pastor Carter shook his head slowly. I don't know yet. I know this. He looked directly at Angela. This isn't the notebook of a man trying to hide stolen money. Angela closed her eyes for the first time since her father's death. Someone inside the church had spoken those words aloud. Across the street, the same dark sedan remained parked beneath the oak trees. The man inside lowered his binoculars. His phone rang. He answered immediately. They've gone inside. A voice on the other end asked only one question. The pastor opened the box. Yes, silence. Then the voice replied quietly, watch them. Line disconnected. Inside the church office, Pastor Carter reached beneath the stack of letters and removed a large brown envelope. Unlike the others, this one carried a warning written across the front. Open only after reading everything else. He looked toward Evelyn. Should I open this now? She answered without hesitation. No, not. Because if you open it before understanding everything that came before, she looked directly into his eyes. You'll make the same mistake everyone else made 30 years ago. Pastor Carter slowly placed the envelope back inside the box. He realized something that chilled him more than anything he had read so far. The truth wasn't hidden inside one letter. It had been carefully built across hundreds of pages. Every receipt, every canceled check, every handwritten note, every forgotten document, each one was only one piece of a puzzle, and someone had spent 3 decades making sure those pieces were never put together. As Pastor Carter closed the lid once more, he looked toward the sanctuary through the office window. In less than 48 hours, he was supposed to preach Elijah Brooks' memorial service. For the first time since becoming pastor, he wasn't preparing a sermon. He was preparing to discover whether his church had built 30 years of judgment on a lie. Pastor Nathaniel Carter spent the entire night inside his office. One by one, he compared Elijah Brooks' handwritten notebook with the canceled checks, donation receipts, and faded church records. The more he read, the clearer one truth became. Elijah had not taken money from the church. He had quietly spent thousands of his own dollars repairing church property, replacing equipment, and making anonymous donations whenever the congregation faced financial hardship. Every document supported the one before it. They formed a single story, one of generosity, not theft. Just before sunrise, Pastor Carter discovered something hidden inside the back cover of the leather notebook. Folded tightly between 2 pages was a copy of an old bank deposit slip. The amount matched the exact sum that church leaders had claimed disappeared 30 years earlier. Written beneath it, in Elijah's careful handwriting, were the words, "Return to the building fund exactly as requested." Only God knows the whole story. Pastor Carter sat back in stunned silence. If this is true, he whispered, then someone allowed an innocent man to carry this burden. He immediately called Deacon Louise Mitchell and asked her to come to the church. Within an hour, she was sitting across from him, slowly reading the notebook. Tears welled in her eyes. "We judged a faithful man without proof," she said quietly. Pastor Carter nodded. "And I almost did the same." Across town, Angela and Marcus waited anxiously at Evelyn Turner's home. Every passing minute felt like another hour. Neither knew what Pastor Carter had found, but for the first time since Elijah's death, hope had begun replacing despair. Late that afternoon, Pastor Carter asked Angela, Marcus, Evelyn, Deacon Louise, and Calvin Reed to meet him inside the sanctuary. The church was empty. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows. Pastor Carter stood behind the pulpit, holding Elijah's notebook in one hand and the wooden box in the other. "Know enough now," he said solemnly, "to admit that I made a terrible mistake." He looked directly at the Brooks family. "I refuse to honor your father based on stories I never verified." Angela remained silent. Marcus lowered his eyes. Then Pastor Carter continued, "But there is still one sealed envelope I have not opened." He placed the large brown envelope on the communion table. "I believe whatever is inside will tell us who benefited from Elijah's silence." Sanctuary fell completely still. Tomorrow, the final secret would finally be revealed. The following morning, Pastor Nathaniel Carter gathered everyone back inside the sanctuary. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows as he carefully picked up the final sealed envelope. The room was silent. "This letter has waited 30 years to be opened," he said quietly. He broke the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter. He began to read. "If you are hearing these words, then the truth has finally been given a chance. I never stole from God's house. The missing money was returned exactly where it belonged. I remained silent because exposing the truth would have destroyed a family already drowning in shame. I chose to carry the blame rather than watch innocent children suffer for the sins of someone they loved." Tears filled Evelyn Turner's eyes. Pastor Carter continued reading. "Do not spend your energy searching for revenge. The people responsible have already answered to God. Let this truth restore what was broken, not create new wounds." The sanctuary remained completely still. Marcus covered his face. Angela quietly wept. Pastor Carter folded the letter with trembling hands. "I believe Elijah Brooks was innocent." He turned toward the Brooks family. "No." He shook his head. "I know he was." He stepped away from the pulpit and stood before Angela and Marcus. "In front of God and everyone who will soon hear this, I ask your forgiveness. I judged your father without seeking the truth." Angela looked at her brother, then back at the pastor. "My father always believed the truth would come." Pastor Carter nodded. "And tomorrow the whole town will hear it." He looked across the empty sanctuary. "Memorial service will be held here. Elijah Brooks. It should have been from the very beginning." The next morning, New Hope Missionary Baptist Church was filled beyond capacity. People stood along the walls and crowded the back doors. Some had come to honor Elijah Brooks. Others had come because they had heard something extraordinary was about to happen. Elijah's casket rested before the pulpit, surrounded by white lilies. Angela and Marcus sat quietly in the front row beside Evelyn Turner. The sanctuary fell silent as Pastor Nathaniel Carter stepped to the podium. He looked across the congregation before speaking. "Before we honor Elijah Brooks, I must first confess a sin of my own." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. "I refused this man's funeral because I believed a story I never investigated. I judged a faithful servant of God without seeking the truth." He held up Elijah's notebook. "For 30 years, this man carried a burden that was never his. These records prove he never stole from this church. Instead, he gave sacrificially, repaired this building with his own money, and protected a family from public disgrace." Many in the congregation lowered their heads in shame. Some quietly wept. Pastor Carter walked to Elijah's casket and rested one hand upon it. "Brother Elijah, I cannot apologize to you face to face, but before your family, this church, and Almighty God, I ask your forgiveness." Then he turned toward Angela and Marcus. "Your father's name is fully restored in this church today." One by one, members of the congregation rose from their seats. Calvin Reed was the first, then Deacon Louise. Soon the entire sanctuary stood in silent respect. No one had asked them to. It simply felt like the only right response. Pastor Carter smiled through tears. "Today we are not burying a thief." He looked toward the casket. "We are honoring a man whose quiet faith spoke louder than the lies told about him." Choir softly began singing, "It is well with my soul." As the final notes filled the sanctuary, sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows and settled gently across Elijah Brooks' casket. The truth had come, not too late for his legacy, and not too late for a town that had finally learned the cost of judging before knowing. Sometimes the strongest testimony is not spoken in life. It is revealed by the truth that remains after we are gone. 6 months later, life in Maple Grove looked different. The faded sign outside Brooks Auto Repair still stood on the corner of Jefferson Street and Pine Avenue, but beneath it hung a new bronze plaque placed there by the town council. It read, "In honor of Elijah Brooks, a man who served others with quiet faith, integrity, and love." Fresh flowers appeared beneath the plaque almost every week. Some were left by people whose names no one knew. Others came from families Elijah had helped decades earlier. Inside New Hope Missionary Baptist Church, Pastor Nathaniel Carter often reminded the congregation that truth must always be sought before judgment is passed. The church created the Elijah Brooks Servants Fund, providing free vehicle repairs for widows, single parents, veterans, and families facing financial hardship. Every act of kindness carried forward the life Elijah had lived so faithfully. Angela and Marcus eventually reopened Brooks Auto Repair. Above the office desk, they placed a framed copy of one sentence from their father's final letter. Let the truth restore what was broken, not create new wounds. It became the heart of everything they did. As for Evelyn Turner, she finally found peace. The wooden box that had rested hidden in her home for 30 years no longer carried the weight of a secret. It had become a testimony. And every now and then, someone passing Elijah's garage would stop, look at the plaque, and quietly say, "I wish I had known him better." Truth was, they had. They had simply listened to the wrong story, because a person's reputation can be stolen in a single moment. But a life of genuine character can never be erased forever. Truth may walk slowly. It may arrive years later, it may even come after the funeral, but when it finally arrives, it has a way of restoring not only a name, but an entire community. Sometimes the greatest lies aren't the ones people tell. They're the ones everyone chooses to believe. Elijah Brooks never fought to clear his own name. Instead, he spent the rest of his life proving his character through quiet acts of kindness. In the end, the truth arrived exactly when it was needed, not to satisfy curiosity, but to restore a man's honor. So before you judge someone's silence, remember this story, because you may never know what burden they're carrying for someone else. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs the reminder that truth may be delayed, but it is never defeated. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.